Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. Very recently, it came to my attention a PowerPoint presentation put forward by one of the teachers in the Charlottesville city schools, but this was presented to the school board. It's racial indoctrination of students, all tied in with sexual indoctrination in one big bundle, and they were so giddy to make this presentation. It's unbelievable to me that there are people who know this and yet they leave their kids in these schools. I mean, people who would be philosophically opposed to it. I can see that there are a number of people, particularly in Charlottesville, but also in Albemarle County, who are plenty happy with taxpayers paying to get this sort of information into the vulnerable minds of their children. But for people who don't feel happy about that and who know about what I'm about to tell you or have a sense of it, it defies logic why they would keep their kids in these government schools. The Charlottesville School Board recently had a meeting and a formal presentation on advancing what they call race and gender programs, anti-racist, anti-bias programs, social studies education in the Charlottesville schools. Now, we know, because we've studied this before, and you've probably heard me talking about it and done your own research, that anti-racist and anti-bias education is premised on anti-Americanism. There's a full-throttle attack against the American founders and American foundational values, and also against capitalism as some sort of an evil. The free markets are undermined and demeaned, and instead socialism is pushed. So that's where they're starting here. Then they start talking about validating people's identities. And this is where it becomes very, very disingenuous, because they say every identity is going to be validated. First of all, why do you need the school or the government by extension to validate your identity? As a student, this is teaching a very bad lesson that somehow, unless the government says you're good, you're not. And second of all, does anybody really believe that they're going to validate, quote unquote, every identity? I can think just off the top of my head of a number that will not. How about the people who would classify themselves as climate realists, people who have Southern heritage in their family that they're proud of, constitutionalists? Or what about evangelical Christians? Do you think they would be validated at these places? If you supported President Trump, you'd be run out of the premises. So it's a total lie. What they want to do is validate the identities that are politically favorable to the schools, the government, and so forth, and everyone else is left out. Focusing on political and racial preparation for teachers, and they want conformity in belief. In other words, they want all the teachers to believe the same way. And so they're going to get these teachers, more and more of them, to go to Changing the Narrative courses. It's called CTN, Facing History and Facing Ourselves, where it's very, very uncomfortable for teachers to go, where they go to learn about implicit bias, a local history, what they call centered around truthful historical narratives. They want to tear statues down, and they want all the teachers to be on the same page. Again, if you stand out, if you have a different point of view, you better keep your head down, because life will be miserable for you in these local government schools. Now, they're starting very, very young. They're starting with kindergartners and first graders, and the topic for the first graders is entitlement to fairness in life. In other words, what happens when life is not fair? When I was young, and probably you too, we used to hear from our parents a lot that life is not fair. And now we're being taught, or now we're teaching our kids in these government schools, that life is supposed to be fair. And if it's not, something needs to be done about it. I thought it was particularly interesting that the fourth graders got a lesson in what I would call the cancel culture, but they didn't call it there. But they're going to help fourth graders in Charlottesville City Schools decide, and I'm quoting now, what's worth remembering. Can you imagine putting the government in charge of what you should remember and what you should not remember? But this is exactly what they're doing. Now, there's a very specific attack on America's founders as quote-unquote protectors of slavery. And of course, you know, by extension, that means that they're calling them racist. All of them who owned slaves, which was probably the majority of the founders, they have been undermined because they've been called old white slaveholders, and therefore their point of view, their work on the foundational principles of the United States of America and our founding documents has all been undermined and deemed worthless or worse than worthless. And here they're just putting it in writing and telling kids that they need to examine all of these things, that the founders are essentially racists. Then they start to ask questions that continue what I call the anti-American narrative. Did the Constitution establish a just government? So now it's all on the table. What they're saying is the government of the United States of America essentially is unjust and therefore invalid. When you ask that question of a child, first of all, you're setting them on the wrong path to think there's something the matter with their country because my teacher told me so. But this is promoting also, alongside of the Constitution establishing a just government, they're promoting a divisive multiculturalism. In other words, we don't have a single American culture that we can unify around. Everybody's culture is equally valid. Everybody's country is equally valid. In fact, probably everybody's Constitution is equally valid. Then we get into the deliberate commingling of race and sexual and gender identities. And this is fascinating. So we're talking about anti-racism here, and all of a sudden we start getting into the LGBTQ community. What has been done wrong here and how they call it intersectionality and how it intersects with race issues. They're trying to build a large coalition. The problem here is, and this is a racial issue which they do not acknowledge, but you understand that this directly contradicts biblical Christianity, this whole idea of I can be whatever gender I want and that God didn't create me, but I'm just whoever I want to be. So you figure that white Christian families in Charlottesville, many of them probably have the means to get out of these government schools and to homeschool their kids or send them to private schools, while the minority Christian families in Charlottesville, primarily the black families who may have a very, very strong Christian faith and totally disagree with all of this, they don't have the means to get out of the schools. So you see the racial bias of the left here saying you must be subject to our schools, you must be captive to our ideas, and we're not going to give you any means to get out. Then they go on to talk about all the work that's being done on this subject. It's not only going to be scored, but it's going to be tracked. And this should disturb everybody. Now we're going to see, we're going to keep very specific notes tracking these students, how they're responding to all of this. And this is where it goes on down the line. As long as they're a government school student, I would imagine they're going to have a little file now that follows how they're doing and how they're responding to these subjects. They ended up the presentation by showing a little bit of a zoom where you have fourth graders in Charlottesville. I call them citizen activists because they're no longer playing with Barbies and Hot Wheels, but now they're being told that they have to ask questions of the people in governance to try to make a change. And I watched just a bit of the Vice Mayor, Sina McGill, interacting with the fourth grade activists, along with the head teacher who's overseeing all of this indoctrination in the government schools. Her name is Neely Minton. It was a pathetic display of kids thinking they have a lot of knowledge on the subject and that their points of view on this, however undeveloped, are incredibly important to the Vice Mayor. She played along with it. And I watched this and thought, if these are the future voters of America, we're certainly doomed. I will tell you once again, and I'll tell you over and over because this is just the tip of the iceberg. I get more information than I can present to the public from behind the scenes. But if this is the direction we're going in, America does not have a bright future. Get your kids out of government schools. Get your grandkids out of government schools. Tell your neighbors to get their kids out of government schools. This nation would be immensely better if we were not subjecting our kids to this sort of brainwashing and now racial and sexual identities from the age of kindergarten on up. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues.
Associated Press award-winning journalist Rob Schilling.
BorderHawk.News is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.News highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.News will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.News. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Looking out for us. Rob Schilling.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome Lieutenant Colonel retired Ray Moore, a Gulf War I veteran, a Bronze Star recipient, author of the book Let My Children Go, and chairman of publicschoolexit.com. Today's topic is getting kids out of government schools and why that's so important. And Colonel Moore, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Hey, Rob, and it's good to be a guest again. We were just trying to figure out when it was before, but I'm glad to be back, and I know what you're doing there, and you're in a very important neighborhood because there's so many wonderful people in that area, and obviously with the University of Virginia nearby, you're reaching a very important segment of the population.
I want to find out how you became concerned and involved in this exodus of getting kids out of these schools, because I think a lot of people look at it and they think it's probably a good idea, but they never go beyond thinking about it. Well,
it really goes quite a ways back. My wife and I started homeschooling our children when my oldest son, he was 6 years old, in 1977, when I was finishing up my theological training at Grace Theological Seminary in Indiana. And we had started a campus ministry at Purdue University, and we had made the transition in August and didn't know exactly what we were going to do, and we weren't going to put him in a public school for some of the same reasons that people don't today, but our worldview wasn't fully formed, and we looked at some of the Christian schools, and they were either financially hard for us, or we didn't feel they were academically rigorous enough. And so I think God just led us by His providence into homeschooling. We call it the family school, and we did that for a number of years, starting in 1977, with all four of our children who are now adults. The oldest boy, who was 6 then, is now 50, so that tells you how old I am. I'm still going strong, but I am 77. And so then in 97, 20 years later, we offered the Exodus Mandate Project, and that website is exodusmandate.org. It's exodusmandate.org, and that's a Christian ministry to get churches and families out of the pagan, now fully godless public schools into Christian day schools or homeschooling. And that was the beginning of that 24 years ago, but now in the light of all that's going on in the public schools, the harm that they're doing is very, very apparent to people now. Plus the COVID shutdown, we're in a new era, probably in a once-in-a-100-year moment for private Christian and homeschooling, private Christian school and homeschooling. So I'm on the forefront of a lot of these groups. You mentioned one called publicschoolexit.com, yes, and I'm chairman of that. It's based in San Diego, but it's reaching out all over the country and got a lot of solid staff people, and we've got a really wonderful web page there on how to get started, how to transition, and why you should either put your kids in a Christian school or to homeschool. So that's kind of the 30 to 40-year version of how we got into this. So we're not new at it. We've been doing it since 1977.
Well, we need more advocates, and we need more people who are in it for the long term, because, again, your tenure in all of this, Colonel Moore, goes far beyond your own children. It was pretty remarkable to talk about how small they were when you started and how old they are now, but you've stuck with it because you know this is a generational issue, and it's not going away on its own.
Right, that's correct. Now, my wife and I also have a book we've written, and they could go to our webpage if they're interested in that. It's called The Promise of Jonah, Building a Christian Family Legacy in a Time of Cultural Decline. They can ask for it on our webpage at exodusmandate.org. But it's a book on parenting children in a very difficult day. We're living in a dark, dark moment of history in our country now, and maybe one of the darkest. And so Christians have got to carry on. They've got to be faithful. They've got to stand up. They've got to stand tall. They can't capitulate and give in to the culture. They've got to be even live stronger and better lives. And it says in, I can't quite remember the text, it said, where sin abounds, grace much more abounds. So we're in a moment where we can really shine out and be very bright for righteousness and for Christ. And one of the ways you can do it is to raise a godly generation. And the Lord has helped me and my wife. Our children are all in the faith, very successful in their life calling. Because we've got 8 grandkids now, and they're in Christian schools or have been homeschooled.
I want to look back at the history so that we give some context to people here, because this is like the frog in the pot when the heat was being turned up, and we can go back to the early 1960s when prayer was removed from government schools, and it seems to me there is a line that can be drawn between then and now, and it's a steep slide.
Right. Well, that's interesting. A lot of people trace the decline of public schools back to 1962 and 63 in the prayer and Bible reading decisions, where they took prayer and Bible reading out of public school. And that was a very precipitous moment in the decline, but that was not the beginning of the decline. The beginning goes back to Horace Mann in the 1840s in Massachusetts, when Boston and Massachusetts set up the very first state-controlled, state-sponsored, tax-subsidized public schools. A lot of people don't know that we didn't have any state-run public education in the United States until around 1840. We dated about 1840. There was a period of 1837 to 1845 when this thing was coming together. Up to that point, all the denominations and churches had their own Christian or parochial schools, and there was a lot of homeschooling and campus schools, one-room schoolhouse. That was the model that existed for 220 years. There was no state-run public education in the United States. Now, there were community schools where they were really kind of a joint thing between the local churches and the community, but they were not pagan, anti-Christian, godless schools. They had catechism, and they were really church-sponsored. And that was the big change. It took place in 1840. Horace Mann was a Unitarian. He was a virulent anti-Christian. All Christians are Trinitarian. Mm-hmm. And he set up that first system. And it spread from there throughout the United States over the next many decades. And by the turn of the 20th century, it had become the dominant system. And the churches gradually gave up their schools and let the government do it. Now, until 1962 and 63, Christians were allowed to coexist in the system. I finished high school in 61, and we still had prayer and Bible reading in homeroom every day. Then we also had chapel about once a month. It wasn't a Christian school with an explicit Christian curriculum or only Christian teachers, but it was friendly to Christianity. It was not a hostile environment, and there was a level playing field. But as you pointed out in 1962 and 63, that began to change radically. So people say, well, that was the beginning of the end in 1962 and 63. We say, no, that was the end of the beginning. It really went down fast then. And churches have just been slow to catch on to it. Right now we're seeing all the debris and waste and garbage from that model that began in 1840, washing up on our shores all at once. And people are just in a daze and a shock over it. But it's not new. It's been going on. And we take the position with the Exodus mandate and also public school exit that the Scripture has assigned the education of children to the family and the church, not government. The state of Virginia has no business educating children at the K through 12 level. Now, people laugh when they hear that because they've been doing it for about 150, 160 years. But we want to get them out and start over and let the churches there in Charlottesville and the neighboring area to be doing the education. They should be the providers, and they should be using a Christian curriculum, and the pastors need to step up and be the men of God that God intended them to be and shepherd their flocks and take care of their children, because they are being harmed now in the public school system.
You know, the importance of pastors is often overlooked in this discussion. In fact, I very rarely hear anyone bring this up, but I agree with you 100% that these pastors should be stepping up at church on Sunday and telling the congregations that they need to get their kids out of these schools. And secondarily, or maybe primarily, they need to be initiating opportunities for kids to get out of these schools.
I'm embarrassed to have to discuss this because I've been in the ministry formerly as in the congregation or director of a Christian ministry now for 45 years. I'm a retired Army chaplain, colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve, and they are failing as a group. There was a study done, Barna Group, it could be 6 or 7 years ago now, I'm a little shaky on the time, but they studied what pastors, and by this we're talking about conservative pastors. We're not talking about liberals. We're talking about Bible-believing pastors. And they found only 9 or 10% of conservative pastors that they believe, like your audience there, strongly and aggressively support Christian schooling. Another 20 to 25% support Christian schools and have their own children there, but they fail to teach and encourage their members to do the same. So they're not really shepherding their people. They may set a good example, and we know churches like that even in our community where the pastor is homeschooling his kids, but he never mentions it from the pulpit. And so 80% of the membership are still in the public school system. So these pastors have an obligation to teach the whole counsel of God and the Word of God on this. And, of course, the reason they don't, and I know this because they tell me that this is what they tell me, I can't do that. I've got public school teachers in my church, and they're worried about losing their jobs. Well, you know, they're going to have a less of a reward from the Lord on Judgment Day if they don't shepherd the flock. And part of shepherding is to take care of the welfare of your families and warn and teach and instruct. And I just hate to have to say this, but it's a real problem. They're the weak link in this whole program right now. Now, happily, a lot of them are stepping up and starting to lead, but it's really late. The hour's late.
Indeed it is. We're talking with Colonel Ray Moore about getting kids out of government schools, how to do it, and what the agenda is behind this. We have somebody new in the White House now. Joe Biden is there. What's his agenda for America's kids?
Well, it's going to be much, much worse. And frankly, I think in a strange sort of way, he's going to help our movement. People, sometimes when the Republicans are in power, they're more conservative and they don't seem to aggressively attack traditional values. And I think with this new administration, we're going to see more aggressive opposition. Well, that just causes people to, pull away from their system. And we know they're going to be pushing transgender ideas more than ever in the public school system. So people are going to be fleeing because they say, look, we just can't leave Johnny and Mary there. They're going to be destroyed. And indeed, they are being destroyed, have been destroyed. So parents are also responsible as well. We've got a lot of information on our webpage if people want to check it out, exodusmandate.org. That's my personal ministry, but now with a lot of information on how to do it, curriculum choices, models. Go to publicschoolexit.com. There's more stuff there but people will have to study this, and they can contact us. Now, on my webpage, we have a tract, a little pamphlet we could send them, called Pastors Taking Cover, and they can get that at exodusmandate.org.
I'm anticipating, because I've heard talk of it, that Democrats who are in control at the state level and maybe seeing it at the federal level as well will start attacking the ability of Americans to homeschool, to make it more and more and more difficult, put more restrictions on. Are you concerned that this is a trend that we're going to see with Democrats in power?
Yeah, I'm concerned that it definitely will happen. Last year, Harvard University Law School was planning a homeschool symposium, and they were underway. It was going to take place in June of last year, on how to deal with this homeschool problem. From the left's point of view, they see it as a problem, and they were taking a position that the presumption is that you should not be allowed to homeschool until you can really prove you're able. Well, you will never be able to prove that we're able, that we have a right to do it to the left. They think the state or the government owns the children, and in God's economy, the children are the stewards. We're the stewards of the children from the Lord, not the state. And that's always been a historic position in all American law, but that's changing. So there will be opposition, but I think it will backfire on them. People say, well, what if the government tells us we can't homeschool our kids? I said, well, what if the government tells you can't worship Jesus? If you can't go to church, if you can't pray, what are you going to do? No, you just do it anyway. You have to be able to defy these people. This is a tyranny. And we need to carry on and do God's work. I have a lot of contacts with some believers in China, and the church there is just exploding. The more the opposition, the stronger they get. And at one time, there were 400 underground Christian schools in China. And in one case, they arrested the headmaster, a school of about 400, and put him in jail. I don't know what his outcome was, but closed the school. Within a year, 10 new schools had popped up out of the one that had closed. You know, the church can thrive under pressure and under persecution. We don't welcome it. Nevertheless, it can happen. So we predict that this movement is going to grow. People are going to pull away. If they're responsible parents, pastors are going to step up and start being the pastors that, God called them to be.
It's a very interesting example that you gave about the government telling churches they can't gather because it's what's been happening across America. And I saw in California there was a Supreme Court ruling that said, well, okay, you can gather, but you can't sing. I think America, by and large, has failed in resisting this tyrannical approach of government. And so do you have hope that people will start stepping up as opposed to cowering?
Barner did some research, and he says this is going to... there are lots of churches that will not reopen because they weren't strong in the beginning, but the ones that step up and step into the moment will become stronger and more vital than they've ever been. So there'll be a kind of a purification that will take place. I think when this COVID thing really initially came, we didn't know what it was, and so people kind of cooperated with the shutdown, and our church temporarily went online, but we're back in service now. We meet regularly and several times a week, but there's about 25% of older people that prefer to stay home, and they're online. They're with us, in Zoom. So the churches are gradually reopening, but I think it was a real illness, a real crisis, but it was greatly overblown in terms of the seriousness. This is not the Spanish flu of 1919. Now, we have had hundreds of thousands of deaths, and I'm not going to say that it's not a big thing, but we have to carry on. And it really affects the elderly, people my age more than any other group. I think 99.5% of college and high school age kids, if they get it, they don't die from it. But I don't have my figures quite correct here, but because I'm not looking at it. But I think about 80% of the deaths are over 65. Mm-hmm. So, of course, if you die or have a family member die, it's a pretty serious thing. But we have to keep going. The church has to meet. It has to gather. And in California, boy, they're really standing up there in a really a brave way and meeting. And I think churches are regathering. And, of course, homeschooling is safe. It's just a family. I think we're going to see things coming back together over the next period of time.
A lot of people only believe what they see, but I think you would agree, Colonel Moore, that this is beyond what we see, that there are spiritual battles going on all around the issue of government schools. So why is that important, and how do we make people aware of the fact that this goes beyond the tangible?
We have a lot of scripture for, Ephesians 6, 10 to 16 says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against evil in high places. And that shows that there are demonic powers that are, manipulating culture. These are behind a lot of the moves. But he tells us there, Paul, in that text, to put on the whole armor of God, to pray. It talks in verse, says, we have to learn how to stand in the evil day, and that's the evil day, not an evil day. So there seems to be a time that comes, the definite article used there, there's a particular moment in history where things are more pronounced in terms of the evil than they might be at another time. We always have had an evil day, but we're living in the evil day now. Christians have to be Christians during a time like that, and the early church certainly was. They were bold and brave, and the church in China is. Many places around the world, believers are suffering. So why do we think in the United States that we're going to be exempt from all of that? And God's appointed this dark period for us. It's a time that we can shine brighter, and we expect Christian education, schools, and homeschooling to just explode. And the COVID shutdown is a dark chapter. That is. The silver lining is that 55 billion children were suddenly sent home at one time. We have research that shows that an absolute minimum of 10 to 15% are never going back to public schools, and it could be as high as 25 to 30% are going to stay home. So there's going to be a huge uptick in private Christian schools and homeschooling, even as I speak. Now, we don't know all that's going to happen because the schools are gradually reopening. I don't know what's happening there in Virginia, but they're sort of reopening in my state. The teachers' union they are not cooperating. They don't want to go back, and so they're prolonging it, and they're hurting their own system. I say thank the Lord for the teachers' union complaining, because they're keeping people home, and parents are just frustrated. They're just saying, well, I've had enough of this. We're just going to do it ourselves.
I looked at a phrase that you used, and I think this is a good way for us to wrap up, because it is very important for people to realize that they are sacrificing children to God haters in the name of convenience. And if they don't ever look at it like that, they're not going to ever take it as seriously as they need to. That's what's happening, isn't it?
Right. Christians somehow put the education of their children in some kind of neutral category outside of religion or theology. These public schools are pagan and anti-Christian in design, practice, and precept. You're putting your children in a false religious system. You don't have the freedom from the Lord to do that. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 6:14, 14 to 18, he says, come out from among them and be separate, saith the Lord, and I will receive you. Putting your children in an unholy place. And we have so much data now that shows that 80% of Christian children who are public school through their careers abandon the church and the Christian faith in their early adult years. Families say, well, I took him to Sunday school. Well, that's not enough. And we're not concerned so much about Sunday school now as we are about Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday school. We don't think they belong there. You've got these churches, these big mega churches. I'm sure there's some there in Charlottesville area that's sitting fallow 5 days a week.
Yes.
And they're not being used properly. And God wants that church to be turned into a school or turned into a homeschool co-op. Families need to get after their pastors and say, look, buddy, it's time that you step up and start being a pastor and the shepherd of this flock, and not just give us little messages on Sunday morning. We want you to take care of these children, help us start a school or a homeschool co-op in this church. And that is happening, but it needs to happen more. And it needs to happen in Virginia, too.
For people who are listening right now and have decided it's time to set their children free from this tyranny of the government schools, let's give them the steps to begin and where to go from there, because I think that's the hardest part, taking the first step.
Well, if they need information, and they can contact my ministry, exodusmandate.org. They can, order materials. They can contact the office using the exodusmandate@gmail.com to make contact if they want to get on the mailing list, and we do have some materials online. The site that I'm working with, I'm kind of wearing two hats now, is publicschoolexit.com, and if they have questions about curriculum, what kind of model, there are many good Christian school models. You've got a couple of groups right there in Virginia, two of the strongest in the nation. One is in Roanoke, Virginia, called Renew a Nation. Hardly recommend them. They're not far away. Then you've got the group called Foundation for American Christian Education. That's face.net, and they're based in Chesapeake, and that's a very old, established ministry, maybe 30 years old, and they do the Principal Approach Christian School, which is probably the best model in the nation, based right in Chesapeake, Virginia. So I'd urge you, Rob, to have the heads of those organizations on your show, and they're not very far away.
It is excellent advice, and I encourage people who have been thinking about this to take that first step. Lieutenant Colonel Ray Moore, we're so appreciative of your efforts over these many decades and your continuing efforts to save the children of America. And thank you so much for joining us here today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you. It's a delight to be with you.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,